The fate of presidential elections are usually based on the state of the economy. But are presidents from one party better at managing the economy than the other? Well, they would both like you to think that. The Republicans are seen as, and like to talk as though they are, the business friendly party. For, well, basically my entire life, Republicans have talked about cutting taxes, cutting regulations, and just overall getting government out of the way. And when you bring these points up, some Democratic activists, especially those online, they like to bring up a list or chart that looks something like this, which claims that 10 of the last 11 recessions happened under Republican presidents. The obvious implication here is that the conservative economic policies of Republican presidents are responsible for these downturns. But there is a substantial problem with this conclusion. It's just a correlation, and it's a pretty narrow one at that. Let's start with the fact that this is a very narrow data set. Most of these claims are based on a list that either only includes post-World War II presidents, or are narrowed even further by excluding Truman. There's also the nature of this data set. Between 1953 and 2021, Republicans controlled the White House for 40 of those 68 years. The longer a single person or party controls the government, then statistically, they are going to see more of anything. The Democrats simply haven't had as many opportunities to see a recession happen on their watch. But most importantly, this correlation is specious at best. There are other correlations out there that are just as factually backed up, if not more so. The past 125 years shows a strong correlation between short-term stock market performance and the position of Mars in the sky, which obviously has no impact on the economy other than it impacting the way superstitious people decide to invest. There's also a strong correlation between rates of accidental drowning in swimming pools and the release of Nicolas Cage movies, which, also obviously, has nothing to do with it.
Now you're the one who's being naive.
Okay, fair enough.
But those are silly comparisons. Let's look at something a bit more comparable. In the last 150 years, 97% of war deaths happened under Democratic presidents. World Wars I and II, Korea, Vietnam, the Cold War as a whole, all started under Democrats. This all happening despite the Democrats claiming to be the anti-war or peace party. This correlation suffers the same problems that the first one does. The fact that it is a limited dataset that just happens to exclude the American Civil War, with a death toll somewhere between 6 and 800,000, that happened under the very first Republican president, is a convenient cutoff for the data. You won't hear most people bring up this point because, well, most of us understand that wars typically are brought on by foreign events, things that the president has very little control over. And the same kind of fact brings down this Republican recessions meme. There is a truism that we all know, but we selectively apply it. That being, the president doesn't control the economy. Everyone likes to point this out when a president of their party is overseeing a bad economy, but conveniently forgets it when their president is overseeing a good economy. It's all weapon nears to hand politics. Even if we all accept that, in large part, presidents don't control the economy, it is kind of peculiar that this pattern just happens to exist. Yes, between 1953 and 2021, the Republicans controlled the White House more often than the Democrats, but still, to have over 90% of the recessions begin under one party when they've only controlled the presidency 59% of the time, that's awful luck. And yeah, that's mostly it. But it's a kind of predictable bad luck. This is where I need to explain the business cycle. In economics, the business cycle refers to a series of stages the economy goes through in repetition. The exact modeling varies depending on the economist you talk to, but this is the general model they all start with. At the beginning of the business cycle, you start to see economic growth. At this stage, there is usually a high unemployment rate, a smaller number of businesses, and the cost of labor, capital, and raw materials are low. This creates a favorable atmosphere for investing. Starting businesses and hiring people is cheap. This is the revival phase. As more people begin to invest, the economy grows, with unemployment dropping and wages rising. The cost of doing business begins to increase. But so long as the profits outpace the costs, the economy can still grow. But if the cost of investing gets too high, we see a decline in investment. It keeps growing until there isn't enough money moving around to satisfy everyone's credit payments. This is the prosperity phase. We then get to the liquidation phase. At this point, the least profitable parts of the economy begin to collapse. These industries lose their investment in sales as people have to prioritize their limited resources to actually profitable ventures and towards paying off creditors. This results in goods from these once overpriced industries to be sold at reduced prices as sales decline. As the once overvalued industries begin to shrink, people lose their jobs, thus raising the unemployment rate. And finally, we get to the depression phase. Once all the bad assets are liquidated, there is less strain on credit, but businesses and individuals are still restraining their own spending. They spend only on immediate necessities. As people and businesses need to increase their sales, prices of doing business goes down. At this point, the economy is ready to start the business cycle all over again. Given this understanding of the economy, you'll see that in the post-World War II US, Republicans have usually been elected during the prosperity phase, while most Democrats have been elected during the depression or revival phases. If you're elected during the prosperity phase, there's nowhere for the economy to go but down. And so whoever is president will face the political consequences of having the economy go south on their watch. In contrast, if a president is elected during the depression or revival phase, the economy has already bottomed out, and there's nowhere else to go but up. Eisenhower was elected toward the end of a boom in the early 1950s, and thus shortly into his term he had a recession. This recession could not have been of his making because he hadn't been in office long enough to implement his policies, much less for them to have had an effect. JFK was elected during a depression phase after a recession in 1960 due to rising interest rates from the Federal Reserve, restricting the credit supply. This not only hurt Nixon in the election, but gave Kennedy and Johnson an easy position to launch an economic recovery. Richard Nixon was elected toward the end of the 1960s boom, in which the economy had been overheated by the guns and butter policies of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, which ultimately killed off the longer post-war boom. Watch this previous video of mine to learn more about that. Because Nixon was elected towards the end of two overlapping booms, he was going to see a significant downfall in the economy. Jimmy Carter becomes the first Democrat elected during a boom in post-war America. Now, this was a 1970s boom, so it wasn't exactly spectacular, but compared to the recession years under Nixon and Ford, it was a boom. But Carter then had to face his own recession, combined with inflation known as stagflation, which until that time was considered economically impossible. The recessed, malaised economy of the Carter years allowed Ronald Reagan to become the first and so far only post-World War II Republican to be elected during the Depression or Revival phase of the business cycle, which allowed his administration to oversee the growing economy of the 1980s. George H.W. Bush had the personal misfortune of being elected toward the end of a very long boom. This meant that a recession was more than likely, which he saw in 1991. Bill Clinton was able to use the recession to his political advantage during the 1992 election, despite the economy already beginning to recover by November that year. Similar to Reagan, Clinton was able to ride the recovery into a prosperous economy, which resulted in George W. Bush getting elected toward the end of a boom. He had two recessions to face. First was the popping of the dot-com bubble in 2001, and then there was the financial crisis of 2007 to 2008. And neither of these recessions were Bush's fault. The dot-com bubble was due to the explosion of the internet in the 90s, thanks to computers getting more widely adopted by households. And the financial crisis was triggered by a housing bubble whose causes are, arguably, the results of the Clinton administration trying to increase minority homeownership. Now, this subject deserves its own video to fully explain it, but the short version is that in the 90s, the Clinton administration began threatening banks and other financial institutions with lawsuits over racial discrimination because they weren't giving as many loans to Hispanic or African American families. Of course, the reason these institutions weren't giving loans to them was because most Hispanic and African American families didn't have the income or capital to finance such an investment, and so they typically didn't give them home loans. When the Clinton administration began threatening them with lawsuits, they needed to start lending more money to minorities. The problem, however, is that approving a loan to someone because of their race is just as illegal as denying someone a loan because of their race. The only way for them to avoid legal action from the federal government was to lower the standards for giving out loans across the board. This change allowed not just poor Black and Hispanic families to get loans, but poor white families as well. This, combined with tax incentives to own homes and a lowered interest rate from the Federal Reserve, resulted in a bunch of people who couldn't afford houses receiving loans to buy them, which created a bubble which eventually popped in late 2007. Anyways, with that tangent out of the way, we get to Obama, who was elected during the Depression phase of the business cycle, meaning that he was going to see an economic boom by the end of his presidency. But the most surprising thing about it was how long it took for that boom to actually happen. I've talked about this before, but there's a difference between the technical end of a recession and the experiential end of a recession. The technical end of the Great Recession was back in 2009, but the experiential end was in 2014 or 2015. The Obama years are seen as one of the slowest economic recoveries in US history, only being beaten out by the Great Depression itself, and for similar reasons. Both Obama and FDR were perceived by investors as unfriendly towards business, especially with constant changes being made to regulations during their presidencies, which delayed recovery. I'll cover that more in a future video. Because the true Obama boom began so late in his presidency, not only was Donald Trump elected during a boom, but it looked like he would have been able to ride it through to 2021. But then COVID hit, which he had nothing to do with, and aside from Project Warp Speed, there wasn't much he could actually do about it from a policy perspective. In the US, the economy was shut down by mayors and governors, not the federal government. On top of that, the economies of the rest of the world were shut down by their respective governments. This is why Trump downplayed the pandemic at first. He knew that his only chance of re-election was for the economy to keep humming along like it had been. But a recession came because of COVID, and even though the technical recession is over, the experiential recession still seems to be going. But I've already gotten too deep into current events, so let me stop there. Presidents lack control of the economy. Interest rates are determined by the Federal Reserve, which is independent of Congress and the presidency. When it comes to subsidies, taxes, and government spending, that's mostly in the hands of Congress. On top of that, there are entitlement programs that have spending increases built into them, like Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare, which are the biggest parts of the federal budget and have caused most of the growth in federal spending. That being said, we shouldn't pretend that the president has no influence over the economy, and over the last century this has only become more so, and they have two main ways in which they could do this. One is the bully pulpit, and the other is the administrative state. The bully pulpit is whenever the president speaks. They can pontificate on whatever they see fit, and the market often responds to it. A president can say that we support X. Market watchers may interpret this as the administration possibly creating subsidies or regulations related to this, and thus choose stocks to buy or sell off in anticipation of federal action, even if it never comes. The other way is through the administrative state. Over the course of the last century, the federal government has expanded with new departments and bureaucracies, and over that period of time, Congress has given the executive branch more and more authority to act on its own. For example, back in the 1950s, Congress gave President Eisenhower the ability to change tariff rates without Congress needing to vote on it. This was intended to be a diplomatic tool for the president, who could offer lower tariffs in negotiations with other countries. Not only was this quicker than waiting for Congress to act, members of Congress no longer had to worry about upsetting special interests in their district. This same power, however, can be used to raise tariffs, which President Trump used in his presidency to wage a trade war with China, which the Biden administration has not yet reversed. Most regulations in the US Code today were written by bureaucrats, not Congress. What has been happening for the better part of a century now is that Congress passes a law giving the executive branch the power to regulate something, but not giving any specifics. In most cases, the president has to follow a legal procedure to make these changes, but they can do them without congressional approval, and more often than not, they get approved. This is why environmental and climate policy swings wildly between presidents. They can change all the rules by themselves, which prevents long-term planning. There's also discretionary powers the president has to influence the economy. The president has a constitutional mandate to enforce all the laws of the United States, but only has a finite amount of resources to do so. This means that each president is given leeway to prioritize what laws they want to enforce. This is how we got our current immigration situation. For several decades, presidents decided not to enforce immigration law, which resulted in a large population of people who are not in the country legally and could be deported at any time by a willing administration, but have economically and socially entrenched themselves in the communities they settled in. But as I mentioned earlier, presidents, in tandem with Congress, can make unfriendly business environments for investors to invest in by constantly changing rules and regulations, thereby increasing uncertainty. This is what happened during the Great Depression along with the Great Recession, which is why both of these recoveries took so long. With all of this understood, most of what happens in the economy is out of the president's control. Presidents can definitely hamper economic growth, but there's not much they can do to foster it without creating bubbles. The fact that 10 of the last 11 recessions happened under Republican presidents has little to do with their economic policies and more to do with timing and the business cycle. And although I think we should stop blaming presidents for when the economy goes bad, we also need to stop crediting them when it goes good. but we'll continue to do that so long as they continue to take credit for them. And if presidents are going to take credit for the good things that happen on their watch, it's only fair that they receive the blame for the bad things too. If this video about the political parties and some kind of modern political myth interests you, then you might be interested in my previous video about how the two parties' positions on the issue of abortion has evolved over time. You can watch that video to see that, or here's another video that YouTube thinks you'll like. Thanks to my patrons for helping make this video possible. If you're interested in becoming a patron and getting perks such as getting to see videos early, you can go to patreon.com/casualhistorian. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.